Hey folks, my name's Kevin, and it's time for a little bit more knife nerdery. Today we have a small details review and comparison of these two Trevor Burger LEXK CFLs. And yeah, that name is an absolute alphabet soup mouthful. We'll talk about what those letters actually mean in a moment. But first, if you watch the unboxing videos, you'll know that this one, the drop point blade version, belongs to a different Kevin. This was loaned my way by Lefty EDC, and it took only a single day of playing with his to realize I needed to pull the trigger on my own. And not only did Kevin lend me his, he actually linked me to this one that he saw for sale, and it happens to be in the Sheepsfoot blade. That is the one that I was actually originally looking for. And so huge thank you to Kevin for both letting me check his out and also for helping me acquire my own. Next up, pause for specs. Okay, so I want to talk about the history of this knife. And if you don't find that stuff interesting, by all means, feel free to skip it. There'll be chapters at the bottom. I find this stuff fascinating, and the EXK models go back a really long way. The EXK started its life as a collaboration between Trevor Burger's father, Fred Burger, and another South African custom knife maker named Mike Skellern. The two collaborated over decades, and they collaborated on a knife that looks basically exactly like this, well, this drop point version anyhow, called the Excalibur. It's a pun on Excalibur, of course, the pun from King Arthur lore, and it's spelled the sword from King Arthur lore, but it's spelled as a mashup of their two names, Skellern and Burger, Excalibur. The Excalibur was produced by both Mike and Fred. They apparently each made versions on their own, but they also worked together and split the production load across their two houses sometimes. But the most famous version of it is the production model released by Boker under the Boker Plus line. Now that was a 3.5-inch knife, and so it's a little bit longer than what you're seeing here today. And it came in a wide variety of configurations and handle materials. There was fancy swirly woods and carbon fibers and G10s, and there was even full titanium versions. And honestly, it was a pretty high-end knife for Boker. Eventually, they released a smaller 2.75-inch model through Boker called the Excalibur 2. But one really big important thing is that they removed this front flipper tab. And that front flipper tab is what lets you do that. They ended up adding in a little nail nick here, effectively turning it into a two-hand opening knife. And I'm assuming they did that to target the European locales that have both length limits and restrictions on one-hand opening knives, but that rubbed a lot of people the wrong way, because the front flipper aspect of it is one of the things that made it really stand out. Can you imagine this knife without having that? Now, over the years, the Burger knives turned into a family business. When Fred started making knives back in the mid-80s, he was also making walking canes. And if you're making both walking canes and knives, naturally you have to make cane swords, right? That's obvious. So Burger cane swords is also a thing, and that's actually what they're called. Eventually, Fred's two sons got involved, with Barry focusing on the cane swords and Trevor focusing on the knives, though I'm assuming there was crossover between those because there's blades in both. And both of those small businesses actually still exist today. You can still buy a Burger cane sword, and as I understand it, they're still being made by Barry Burger and a small team of local craftsmen. Likewise, Burger Knives lives on through Trevor, and now under the branding of Trevor Burger Customs. And Trevor still makes the same Excalibur design, now renamed the EXK, and that's where EXK comes from. EXK is just the first three letters of Excalibur, EXKELIBUR. The EXK has evolved a lot over the years, and it still comes in multiple form factors. I saw a comment recently where Trevor claimed that the original EXKs had thumb studs, and I looked everywhere, but I couldn't find any pictures of that. But this dates back to the point where internet wasn't really documenting everything, or wasn't even really existing all that much. The closest thing I was able to find is that there was a knife that Fred Burger designed that uses basically this exact same handle pattern, but it has a very different blade shape. And that one had thumb studs, and it was called the Evolution. Now, I was able to find a flipper tab version of the EXK. Now that technically too has a different name. It's called the tenere, which is the Italian word for the verb to hold. But from what I can tell, it's effectively the exact same knife, just with a flipper tab. And having seen how incredibly sleek this is, and just how kind of clean these lines are, honestly, in my opinion, that flipper tab really stands like a sore thumb. The blade, it design itself has changed over the years. They've always offered this kind of more spear point-esque drop point version, and I believe it's also always been in a hollow grind. But how far up that hollow grind come has changed some. They've always offered this full height version like you see here, but there's also versions that have some amount of a flat and a swedge, just like you see here. Eventually, Trevor introduced this sheepsfoot variant, and that's where this swedge ended up. And that brings us to today. There's a bunch of different versions and models, and the naming scheme can be pretty confusing, so let's try and clear that up. These days, the EXK comes in two sizes. There's the standard EXK, and that's 2.75-inch blade. That's just quite small. And then there's this. This is the LEXK, which is 3.34. That L just stands for large or long. And again, the EXK part itself is just the first three letters of the original name Excalibur. So now it's worth noting that the larger LEXK is still smaller than that original 3.5-inch Excalibur knife. So these aren't big knives no matter which one you get. The smaller size is the same as they did before, 2.75-inch blade, but they kept the front flipper aspect this time around, which is thank goodness, right? Now, regardless of which size you get, EXK or LEXK, they both come in three different form factors, which just adds to the confusion. There's base, plus, and then some FL variant, either CFL or SFL. And the base versions are basically exactly what they sound like. They're the simplest construction and the more basic materials. They're liner locks, but interestingly, they only have liners on one side, which gives them this asymmetric shape. They also use phosphor bronze washers, which is worth noting because all of the other versions are on custom-made ceramic ball bearings. If you go to the plus line, that's where things start to get fancy. These are still liner locks, but they have a second tie liner, which makes them symmetric now, and they also run on custom-made brass cage ceramic ball bearings. This is also where you start to see premium materials in the handles, milling striping like you see here, and you get pivot collars and bolster designs where you have two different materials on it and everything like that. And the final format is the either C or SFL. These are frame locks. The C stands for indicate whether the handles are contoured in this dimension or flat slabs for S. C for contoured, S for slab. There isn't a meaningful difference in fanciness here compared to the plus line. In addition to milling and bolsters, you'll have inlays, because they can do that in a frame lock version, and sometimes those inlays get into exotic materials. You'll find like a mammoth bone and stuff like that. But for the most part, the big difference between the plus and the CFL line or the SFL line is a matter of whether or not you prefer frame locks or liner locks. But there is one noticeable difference, and that's the blade stock thickness. Because both of the liner lock versions, both the base and the plus, use 3mm or 0.118 blade stock, while the frame lock version uses 3.5mm 0.138 blade stock. And so while neither of these are particularly thick, 0.118 and 0.138 is meaningfully different. And we'll talk about we'll bring that difference back up again when we focus on the blade itself and how it performs. Okay, let's talk about these blades, because this is one of the places where these knives truly shine, and Trevor Burger really impressed me. So, to start off with, let's discuss this finish. Both of these knives have a hand satin finish, and it looks gorgeous. The way this is accomplished is by taking sandpaper and rubbing it back and forth very carefully by hand, hence the name, in this perfectly up and down pattern. It takes a long time to do, and it's a little bit more expensive as a result. It's kind of a luxury finish. I do think it's really, really beautiful, but if I'm being completely honest, it's not my favorite finish. And the reason is because it basically shows wear really, really quickly. I'm the type of person that likes to use my knives, and so I tend to prefer a user finish, not because it matters that it gets scratched, but because I can't help but feel that kind of reservation when I feel like I might scratch a knife. And since most of the time when you're cutting, you're either going to be kind of pushing down or sliding forward or backward or both. And so most scratches you're going to make on a knife are going to be, something in the diagonal or up and down direction, never going to be perfectly in line like this. And so anything you make is going to show. Now, I don't know how much is going to show up on camera here, but this knife came to me with a couple of scratches on it already. This is a user for Kevin. And again, it's really not the end of the world. It's just one of those things where I would rather it be a stonewash finish because of the types of mental hangups that I personally have about not wanting to scratch something really pristine. And to a degree that you can kind of get that done, because Trevor does offer an acid stonewash, but I wish that he would stop halfway and not do that acid part, because a stonewash, I think, if done right, can look really, really elegant and beautiful still. Acid stonewashes look cool, but they look like really kind of ultra worn in this way that I think just kind of clashes with how streamlined and, kind of gentlemanly these knives already look. The blades themselves are the exact same thickness at the base, even though this one looks so much thinner. They both start at nearly exactly 1 full inch, 0.97. This one obviously thins out a lot more. This one at the top is a drop point. It looks almost like a spear point, and sometimes you'll see it marked that way, but it's not quite symmetric, so it's not quite a spear point. And this one here is a modified sheepsfoot. Sheepsfoot because the blade is nearly perfectly flat across the bottom with the point at the bottom, and the top is nearly perfectly parallel along it, coming to a distinct point and then falling down. Modified because none of those things are quite there, and I had to say nearly for every single one of them. Now, the side effect of this swooping up and having more belly, the modified part, means that it is thinner at the bottom than it is at the top because you're moving further up this grind. This does start off very, very thin behind the edge. This is 0.013, 13 thousandths behind the edge, which is exceptionally thin. For reference, 20 is an excellent slicing. 15 is an exceptional slicer. Below 15 means that your resistance to entering motion material is amazingly minimal. It's incredibly thin. Now, because this moves up this grind all the way up to the tip up here, we're finally hitting about 20 thousandths. But again, that's where a lot of knives are hitting, and that's good. So for this to be that at the worst point is quite nice. It also means that you do have a fair amount of meat right there behind the blade. This is one of those things where it's precise enough, but there's enough meat behind it that I don't feel like I'm worried about using this tip. This grind is a hollow grind, and it does stay pretty thin for a while. I'll pop in a picture that shows this in a moment when I get to that one, because oh my god, but this stays pretty thin for a while, and this hollow grind means that this slices very, very, very well. This isn't the thinnest blade stock in the world, but it's also not thick by any kind of normal standards, and so the result is this knife is a very very good slicer with a very, very good utility blade. And so this is for my types of uses where I tend to be cutting on surfaces, cutting out shapes, or opening boxes, this is almost a perfect blade for me. What's nuts though is this one. This is not what I originally wanted to go for. I think stylistically it's just not my perfect taste, but the hollow grind on this is absolutely bonkers. I have never in my life seen something ground this thin for so long. Trevor Burger knows how to do a hollow grind so well. So this comes even thinner behind the edge. This is 12 thousandths behind the edge, but the bigger deal is that this stays thin for so freaking long. Like I said earlier, hitting 20 thousandths behind the edge is good by most knife standards, and this doesn't hit 20 thousandths until about a quarter of the way, a little bit past a quarter of the way up the blade. And it keeps on going from there. It doesn't hit 40 thousandths behind the edge until more than halfway up. And the result is that this just stays super, super, super thin for so incredibly long. Your kinesthetic sense is your actual sixth sense. This is the part of your sense that allows you to tell, sense motion and your general proximity of your body relative to itself. It's the thing that lets you close your eyes and still touch your nose successfully. And if you run your fingers along the edge of a blade, that's the thing that kind of gives you, finger calipers, your sense of how thin this is. And what's crazy is on most knives, including this one, on most knives, even if it's really thin behind the edge, you feel the material between it. And this one is so thin for so long that it really genuinely feels like there's nothing between your fingers. I have my fingers across this entire bottom half of the blade, and it genuinely feels like they're just touching each other. It's nuts. The result of this is that this slices absurdly well for certain kinds of slicing. It slices really well for everything, but absurdly well for certain things. I've talked in the past about this The TRM Shadow being my go-to cardboard knife because this just glides through it like a dream. It gets really thin behind the edge, but nowhere near as thin. This is hitting a little over 20,000. It's about 2021, and this is 0.09 blade stock. Is that right? 0.009. 0.09. Yeah, 90 thousandths. And so the result is that this knife enters materials well and then meets very little friction resistance as you're trying to push the materials, and those materials want to wedge. This is the type of thing that won't wedge. Now, this blade stock here is not thick, but it's certainly thicker than that. And the result is that this is so much thinner down here that if you're cutting through stuff that never really goes past this point of the blade, then this cuts better than this by such a large degree. This just glides through. But it's only until you start cutting through thicker things, like really pushing down through double-walled cardboard, where this extra thicker blade stock at the top starts finally dragging. But I will say, this is an exceptionally well done hollow grind in both its thinness, but also its transition to the top. And so I never felt any point where this thing was dragging. It definitely drags a little bit more when you get to really dense things up at the top, but barely. So on that regard, these both slice exceptionally, but this one slices holy crap. And I forgot to mention, this is specifically where that thinner blade stock found on the liner lock versions will actually make a difference. Because, again, this doesn't drag much at all because of how thinned out this gets, but it's the thickness at the very top that's going to cause the most drag when pushing through thick, dense materials. And so having 0.118 blade stock on the liner lock versions will mean those will drag even less. Now, this blade shape here has a swedge at the top, like we've talked about. And this forms, I guess, two main purposes. One is aesthetic and one is functional. From an aesthetics perspective, I think it just looks really cool. It adds a neat additional element to this knife that I just like the look of. And especially when you're looking down from the top up here. Let's see if I can get that to focus. It just has a really neat look. It's that kind of cool little point that it comes to. From a functional perspective, a swedge does two things. And the first is to thin out the blade as you go on. As you can see, when this flat part here, I'm gonna get this out of the way or maybe just put it right underneath. This flat part here is the full thickness of the blade stock. So this is 0.137 inches thick. And it stays that full thickness as long as this flat stays in existence. And so right about there, up until here on the knife, this is still 0.137 inches thick. And it's because this swedge dips down below that line and into this grind that it starts to thin out the knife. And the thing is, it does do that, but just not by a whole lot. It gets to 0.125 out here. So it is technically thinning it out and making it easier to pass the materials closer to the tip, but only by a little bit. Where it is a detractor, though, is in a really choked up pinch grip. So one of the ways that I hold this knife the most, we'll talk about this more when we get to the handle, is in a pinch grip. And I think it works super, super well in this kind of choked back pinch grip. My finger rests along this and it just is so comfortable in my hand. But sometimes I like to choke up further, kind of have my thumb on the blade and have my finger closer to the tip. That way, if I really want a lot of control right up at the tip, or if I want to be able to really push down on the tip. And that second thing kind of sucks with a swedge like this, because if you are trying to really push pressure down with your finger, you're pushing right onto this little point right here, this edge. And it's not that it's sharp or anything like that, but it is an edge. And so you feel it. And I don't think it's bad. It's just not, this isn't the kind of knife where I would really, really want to push down. And the thing is that sheepsfoot blades are some of the times that I do want to do that because of how good they are at cutting on a surface. And so it's a little bit disappointing when I see that. I think it looks cool, but it's a trade-off. On this one here, the spine stays thick all the way down, not the full thickness. It starts to thin out the moment that it drops down on this drop point. And actually, as it gets towards the end, I wonder if I can get that to focus correctly. It's actually it becomes crowned. So there's like a bit of a chamfering that's going on here, and then it turns into basically a full crown spine down here. And the result is that this feels very pleasant to have your finger on. In this very choked up direction, this feels really, really nice. But because the point comes up higher, it's not quite as good at being able to use that tip to cut. I have to lean my wrist down further, so it's not as ergonomic. But being a drop point, it's not as bad as some where it's all the way up to the top. And so I think this works really well in some regards for these types of utility cuts, but not quite as good as this. Let me think, what else do I want to talk about this? These are both in LMAX steel. There are versions of these that are in M390, and between those, for at least my use cases and where I live and the kind of moisture and everything I have, those are basically interchangeable. Yeah, technically M390 can be better if it's treated perfectly, and so yeah, if they're both like optimal versions, I guess I would pick that one over the other, but they're in the same class of super steels with very similar properties, and so I personally don't care at all that this is LMAX instead of M390. If you go back farther enough, the EXK was done in N690, and that's one of the things where I do care about that. That is a whole level down, if not even more, on general edge retention, corrosion resistance, all that kind of fun stuff. And so I'm very glad that these are now being done in either LMAX or M390, and I think that's the right way to go. I think the last thing I wanted to talk about with this blade is a comparison of this guy here and the Holt Haptic. Because while these are definitely different blades, they share a lot in common. And that's it's not surprising then that these are two of my absolute favorite blades. They both are hollow ground modified Sheepsfoots with a flat that extends further past this swedge that thins out the blade. And so they're definitely distinct and different, but these both cut exceptionally well. These are fantastic, like all-arounder EDC utility cutter type knives, which is what I do with knives, and so I love these. The last thing I wanted to show about this, though, is the finish, because this is what I would love to see on that. This is a very shiny, there you can see my face right there, hello. This is a very shiny stonewash finish, and they do a near mirror stonewash as well, and I don't need it to be that, but this level would hide whatever tiny scratches are on this super well, but still look refined and elegant on the knife, and that's what I would love to have seen here. The next things I'd want to talk about for these blades is the sharpening choil and the plunge grind, and it's done really, really well here. You can see that the plunge grind, the thing that takes it from the full thickness down to the thinnest behind the edge, ends right at about here. That's where the curve ends. And so this is at the very top. Now, I will say that especially on this version that is just kind of shorter, it's not a very deep sharpening choil. You don't have a ton of space to sharpen here, but it does thin out before all the way up here. And as a result, you do have at least this entire vertical distance. So that's pretty well done. The next thing I want to talk about is the detent engagement. And so what that is how far from a completely open position do you have to close the knife before you hit the detent ball but are not yet up on it. You have to surpass that distance, whatever it is, in order to be on the tang of the knife and actually be able to close without resistance. And on both of these, it is almost exactly 17.5 degrees. I would like to see it closer to 10. But 17.5 is not bad. A lot of makers just aren't thinking about this yet, and so the result is that you'll find really high-end knives like Shiragorov's even, where it's like 20, 24 degrees. And so 17.5 isn't bad, but the earlier that you have this engagement, the more quickly you can take your thumb out of the way and just be able to close it. But I will say that these knives are not hard, especially because you have the over travel stop, to just kind of push over all the way and let it fall down like that. Both because of this little nook right here, and because of this little groove right here, you either are going to have that catch your finger, or your finger's going to hit into this spot. And so it's pretty easy to have this fall and have this blade not be worried about that blade hitting you. And so in that regard, getting past the detent ball ramp is pretty easy if you just let it fall to your thumb. What I will say is that once you hit this though, getting up on is interesting because this knife does have a detent ball ramp of sorts, but it's different than I've seen on most other knives. And unfortunately, it's not quite as effective as some of the others. And so the way that most detent ball ramps work is they mill or grind or whatever, a little tiny notch in directly along the path that the detent ball travels. And so it'll be kind of set back and it'll be just this little notch. And what Trevor does instead is he lobs off this entire corner. And I think it's going to be really difficult for me to get my camera to show this, but maybe if I zoom in, can you see this? Right here, this entire corner has been cut back off. And it's bigger actually on this knife than it is on this one. This is the Sheepsfoot. And you can see he does it here too. This corner is lobbed off, but not as dramatically. This is a much more dramatic cutback. And so what he's done, I wonder if I can see it from the other direction better. Maybe in there? Or maybe if I hold it like that? Ooh, yeah, you can kind of see that. See how there's this little triangle shape right here? This is the entire corner knocked back. And so when the detent ball hits this, it uses that as a slight ramp to push up. I will say slight though, because of the positioning. So on most all knives like this, you're going to try and move this detent ball as far out in this direction, far away from the blade as possible, because it's going to maximize the amount of lever arm distance the detent ball has, and so the amount of torque that it can hold in. So you want to move that out as far as possible to not accidentally run off the edge of the tang. So it's always very, very, very at the end. And so even though there is that corner lobbed off, it's still hitting kind of the utmost corner of that corner. So that's sounding kind of silly sounding, but I'm saying instead of hitting right here in the center of what I have this acting as a ramp, it's hitting right here on this very edge. And so it's pretty minimal, the degree to which this is acting as a ramp. And it would be better, it would work more functionally if the ball was like, for example, all right here. But there's reasons, like I said, why they move it out as far as possible. So the thing is, this does have a detent ball ramp of sorts. It's just not the most effective. So as a result, pushing up this ramp is pretty easy, but it's nowhere near as smooth and bump free as some knives that have a very, very thoroughly effective detent ball ramp. So let's move back and talk about these handles. The handle shape here is the thing that's been consistent across the EXK all the way back to its original Excalibur design. It's what makes the EXK as far as I'm concerned, considering the blade shape can change. And it's also what makes this distinct from, say, the Atlas, which comes up further up here and has a little bit fuller of a belly back here. This handle shape is really quite nice. It's one of those ones that's kind of neutral, kind of not. It's got enough curves to it in the right places that it fits in your hand really nicely, and it's got just enough of kind of indexing here that it feels good, but it's not so sharp that it matters if you're kind of scooted up a little bit. We'll talk about that in just a second. So we've got along this back spacer here, and then this is super, super aligned. This is one of those things that they talk about when saying like the tiers of greatness. What was the difference between a high-end knife and an ultra high-end knife? And just how incredibly smooth this transition is a sign of just how good the tolerances are in this knife. But where that matters in practice, why you would care, is that when this is in your pocket and your hand slides down past this, the fact that this curves here and that this is such a clean, smooth transition is that when your hand goes past this, it glides right past and it feels really, really nice in pocket. This part up here fits into my hand mostly like this, where my index finger is going to this first groove, but you'll notice that it's pretty big. So I have medium-sized hands, but on this maybe on the slightly smaller side of medium. And so this knife fits me really well, but does give me a little bit of extra room. And as a result, if I want to, I can actually choke up with the width of my fingers. I can kind of fit them into this spot. It's a tight fit for me, but I can choke up further and have this my finger on the spine back here and get all the way up in it. And when that matters with this one, because that's what would put my thumb right on this spot right here at the end, right before I get onto that swedge. And so this actually feels really, really comfortable, but choked back a little bit further is actually still quite comfortable. One of the things I love about these though, and where this kind of curve matters, is in that pinch grip I was describing earlier. Because one of the most common ways that I will hold this is to nestle this curve back here into my palm, put my finger right there against this little nook, and pull back in like that, and then place my finger along the spine. And this is such an incredibly comfortable, in control feeling grip on this knife. It just fits perfectly, and I love it. As far as the handle goes up here, this shape here curves back in part because of this flipper tab. There's another model that he makes called the Atlas, like I said, and that comes up and stays more pronounced up here. And as a result, it needs to have a higher flipper tab. In part, that flipper tab is higher to give you kind of more leverage, I suppose, as you try and actuate it. But the other aspect of it is that if you had a smaller flipper tab, it would be basically covered up right now if I had an Atlas body on this. And so by having this trail down like this, you're still able to maintain contact with this flipper tab. In fact, your contact point gets even better and bigger as you go. And so the fact that there's jimping down this entire bit right here means that as you are rolling this over, you're able to maintain traction on this jimping right here and pull this closed. And so this feels very secure, even if you're doing a slow roll. But even with this small round hair, you can get a very nice thwack. We'll talk more about that when we talk about action. But to talk about that a little bit more, let's talk about the shape and positioning of this lock bar. So these are the CFL versions, and these and the SFL would both have a frame lock here. And this looks like a reasonably thin lock bar from this dimension, and it is. Some lock bars will be significantly thicker down this way. It's definitely thick enough in this regard that this is a very strong lock bar, and there's actually pretty firm pressure here. Like, this requires a decent amount of pressure to push away. That's one of the things, again, we'll talk about in action, because the liner lock is supposedly smoother as a result of there being less tension there. But what I wanted to say about this being thinner is that it's actually a positive for a front flipper in particular. Front flippers need to have not a lot of lock bar detent strength, and the reason is because you have a very small amount you have small leverage because of how small the flipper tabs tend to be on front flippers, but also because you hold front flippers in your hand in a precarious way. On most other deployment method type knives, you have the ability to grip it in a really secure way while you then actuate the flipper. But in order to operate a front flipper, you kind of have to hold it in this awkward, precarious way. That means that you're not really able to get good traction. Like, this is in my hand, but I would not swing my hand around a whole bunch. As a result, you don't want a super strong detent that would make the knife open with such an incredible amount of force that it would risk ricocheting out and bouncing out of your hand. And as a result, you don't want to have your fingers on this lock bar. It's important that you don't want to have your fingers on this lock bar. And so having the lock bar be smaller like this means that there's a lot more room for you to put these upper fingers, depending on how you want to hold it. I will say I rarely put these fingers on the knife at all. When I'm actuating a front flipper, I tend to grip it down here against the clip, kind of leave this one off entirely, and just swing it back like that. But if you are someone that feels more comfortable gripping onto this, you have a lot more space here. This would also matter to lefties like Kevin, who loaned me this one, because it means that if you're trying to flick, there's more space for you to put your finger without completely pressing on that bar. I don't know how much that matters for front flippers. You'll have to go talk to him, watch his videos, but I know that would certainly matter for things like reverse flick whole knives. Now let's talk about action. This is one of the places where these knives really, really shine. They have a really satisfying action. This little tiny flipper tab looks like it would be hard to actuate. It looks like it would be difficult, but my God, It works so well. This is by far one of the best front flipper actions and designs in general that I have ever felt on a knife. It is very simple to deploy, and as a result, it's just like, ooh, you get a good thwack. This flipper tab, I should have gotten a couple more out. Right. So this front flipper tab is really quite small. You'll see on some, this is the Kaiser G or Genie, and this is the Boost Aero Mini. They have a much more pronounced flipper tab. And like I said before, the Atlas that he makes also has a much more pronounced flipper tab. And in part, that lets you get leverage. But it means that you have this really jabby thing. And to some people, that looks really, just looks bad. I think some people think it looks cool, but some people just really don't like it. To me, I don't mind it, but I don't love when it's like literally jabby. So like this version here with the chamfering means that this doesn't hurt even if it jabs you, if you poke onto it. This one kind of does. One of the benefits of small, tiny front flipper tabs, like you'll find on the Shamwari or the Shamwari, or this is the Wii Production Shamwari version, or this, is that these little corners here barely even show up. People that don't know what a front flipper is wouldn't even know that that's what's going on here. And as a result, they take up very little space, they look really refined, and they don't hurt even if you touch them. I will say, though, that the overall positioning of this works better. And part of the reason is that it's higher up from the pivot. And as a result, if you look at how much leverage you have, your lever arm distance here on the Shamwari or Shamwari is about this far. And if you compare that over here, it's just about that much longer. So it's probably about that much more lever arm distance. And so you have more torque that you can put on the knife. I had to tune this knife. When this came to me, this Shamwari, the lock bar strength was too strong, and I found it incredibly difficult to actuate with how little amount of lever arm I could actually push on this. I found it pretty hard to do, and I had to tune this to lighten this lock bar pressure. And that was really interesting to me because this one has a firmer lock bar. It has a harder detent, and as a result, I expected this one to be just as hard and something I might want to have to tune, but nope, this is so easy to use. Oof. Now, I will say though, as much as these are designed as front flipper knives, that's what they're marketed as and everything like that, I gotta be honest, I rarely use that. And the reason is because this. Oh my God, it works so well as a middle finger flipping knife. So when I got this one out and started playing with it, that was one of the things that Kevin told me I should check out, because on knives like this that have the blade sticking out from the handle enough that you can get in there, and if you can get into the grind itself, it means it's easy to get traction against that grind, place your finger on it, and pull the knife out. That's something you can't do on this, and one of the reasons why this knife is exclusively a front flipper knife. In fact, it's really hard to open this knife with a little pinch because of this is basically a one-hand opening and can't be a two-hand opening knife. But on knives like this, you can really easily wedge your finger against it and pull it out. And as a result, especially because this one is a hollow grind, it means that the angle you're going at is actually pretty steep. If it were a flat grind, you'd be pushing against the bevel here, and it'd be kind of just like a shallow ramp. But being a hollow grind, I'm not gonna be able to twist my hand to do that. Anyway, it's like you have much sharper ledge to press against, which means you get really good traction. The result is that this, leaning your finger like this against it and pulling out, is super easy to use. I tend to flip knives like this, or I tend to flip knives like this, and in both of these cases, I'm kind of wedging the bottom back here. But on a knife like this, where I'm trying to use the blade tang itself, I have to anchor, I have to pinch it more like that, and I have to anchor the bottom not against my palm just like that or something, but instead pulling this back with my fingers. And so I hold it like this with my fingers back here, my hand on there, and this gives me a really secure grip. I then reach my finger down and just fling it out. And oh my God, that works so well. so incredibly well that this knife is easier and more fun to middle finger flick than a heck of a lot of knives with spidey holes that are designed and sold as middle finger flicking knives. I love the way it feels. It has a very, very good clunk, and so I find this incredibly fun. And the fact that I can do that with this knife makes this so much more compelling to me than just the flipper only version. And I was really nervous when I ordered this that I might not be able to do it, because you can see how much less the blade sticks out, and that grind is much further back. So there's less blade and less grind to begin with, and I was worried that I might not be able to get in, but there is actually a perfect amount of space right here. And again, because it is a hollow grind, you really have a deep wedge to go in, and as a result, this flicks so freaking well. I love it. Now, I will say that there's a really big difference between the way that these feel and sound when you deploy them, and that's entirely to do with the blade shape. This one has a hollow grind, so it does still thin out, so you do still get some of that kind of bell-like ting, but it's not a lot. This is very much a thwack knife. This has a very satisfying thwack, but is very much a thwack. And as a result, this is one of those knives that just feels solid. As a comparison, this, I don't know how well this is going to pick up on my camera, but I'm telling you, in person, that blade sings. This is so thin for so long that you do get the thwack sound, but you also get that bell-like tone, and it just tings in this really delightful way. Again, don't know if it's going to pick up because those are really high frequencies, but you hear it and it sounds so good. So while I love this blade shape for its cutting purposes, and I just think it's a really great utility knife, this one sounds markedly better. One of the times you can really hear it is if you do the reach round style, and this works really well on both of these knives. That is where you pinch the knife like this. I usually tend to put my finger down along it to give more stability, because if I just pinch in one spot, it can swivel, where if I do that, it's a little bit more secure. And you reach your finger over and you pull back. And it works really well. And the reason why you hear the sound even more when you do that, ooh, did you hear that? Let's see if I can get that with the camera. The reason you hear it more is because in this grip, you're barely holding on to the handles itself. And compared to this, where your hand is deadening that echo and that reverberation, with this, you have so much more of that kind of tuning fork quality. Ooh, this sounds so freaking good. I really hope my camera's picking it up, because it is truly amazing. They also sound really, really different on the close. You can hear this one. Compare that to this one. This one is much, much higher pitched. I'm not entirely sure why that is. I was kind of expecting this one to be higher, but I guess the reality is that this one just has more reverberation, so it has more of like the bigger bell you have, the lower it is. The other thing about the action that people always talk about is closing. And that's another place where this thing is freaking crazy. Yeah, some people, especially Kevin, really want a knife to do that. They really want that completely guillotine free fall action. And I will say, there is something tremendously fun about that. I get it. It is tremendously kind of exciting to see how smoothly and freely it falls. Like, it just feels a little bit riveting in a way. And it also, from an engineering perspective, it's really impressive when a knife can do this free fall action but still have a crisp detent. Because making a knife free fall is not difficult, but making a knife free fall and still have detent is really quite difficult. So from that perspective, knives that do this but still do that are an engineering marvel. But I don't personally really want knives to do that. It's fun, it's interesting, but it's not super practical, because I don't want a knife to cut my thumb off. Well, okay. If a knife is going to be a knife that I'm using to actually cut, which is what I want most knives to be, I want an action where I can safely close a knife and have that feel really good, but not worry that I'm going to mess it up or cut it, or that I have to pay close attention, or that I have to like kind of kick my finger out of the way. And so as a result, these knives have one of my favorite kinds of actions. It's not quite as like good as that, what is it? So this is my Southard Mini Toke by Brad Southard, and this is the one I always say is my favorite action. And the reason is because this is so incredibly easy to close. It feels like it's biased towards close, but it stays exactly where you put it. This is, I think, the single best closing action from my tastes of any knife I've ever felt. I think this thing is freaking amazing. And if you do any amount of closing whatsoever, it's just, it swings home. These are not quite there. These are definitely more like very light, gentle shakes. But the thing is, this is nearly perfect because the amount of effort you need to close it, I'm having to be so incredibly gingerly there in order to make it not close. The amount of effort you need to close it is almost none. And so from a ease of closing perspective, this is really, really functional. But from a, not having to get your finger out of the way and not be, from a safety perspective, it's right up there. But the biggest part, the biggest thing, and I think that makes this so impressive, is this smoothness. And yeah, you'll hear a lot of people use the word glassy, and I've used the word glassy. I've owned a lot of knives that I thought felt glassy, but the reality is none of them, not a single one of them, compares to this. This is truly mesmerizing. This is a level of frictionless that I genuinely don't know how they're doing. I don't understand how even with polishing all of these surfaces that are touching each other, that you can make something slide this well, because this truly has no perception of motion in it. And that is astounding to me. And so as a result, this is one of those knives that if you do feel it close, it feels exceptional. And so if you're shaking it close, there's only this lock bar pressure that is making it hold back. There is no like gritty kind of friction feeling at all. This just feels so incredibly nice. So the last thing I want to talk about is the fit and finish of these knives. And that is one of these places where this knife is, again, just really, really incredible. All of the little details on this, all of these edges, everything is just done exceptionally. I think the contouring shows up well when you look at it from this angle, and the contouring feels really, really nice in your hand. I imagine that the SFL slab ones don't feel quite as nice. And it's similar, like when you go with the plus route, you can get ones that are contoured, or you can get ones, the base route where those are flat. And if I can have subtle contouring, I always want there to be subtle contouring. And as a result, while this is subtle, it's not some dramatic contour, this just feels really, really nice. And all of these little edges, every single little thing is just so well handled. I can't find a single part of this knife that feels bad. The lock bar access in here, the way that this chamfer is here, the way that this is chamfered right there is a scallop. Everything is just, it feels fantastic. I'm genuinely really, really impressed. This is the same kind of carbon fiber that I have on my Herman Vespertilio. And what's interesting is that the finishing, because this is like a milled surface, it looks kind of lighter in color and almost dull from a visual perspective, but look at the way it swirls. If you look at it on the Vespertilio, this is the same material. This is red dark matter fat carbon. And here, because this is a polished surface, look at how much more that pops. Compare these two side by side. This one looks so much more red and so much brighter. Is my lighting going to show that correctly? Anyway, the point is, they are just different approaches. And so, yeah, From a finishing perspective, I kind of like the way this polish looks, but I think this just looks fantastic. And there's so many materials you can choose from. You can find all sorts of crazy exotic inlays on these. And so from a finishing perspective, I think the stuff he does is just absolutely spectacular. I will say though, that he doesn't do much in way of anodizing that is very exciting at all. Almost all of his knives have this same blue backspacer, blue clip, blue pivot collar thing. It's not always a blue pivot collar if the knife doesn't make sense with blue pivot collar, but it's usually. And so what you won't find on his knives is that kind of like really crazy exotic anodization with two tones and stuff like you'll find on something like the Haptic. And so from that perspective, it's not like the most insane finishing work in that regard, but my God, all of the little details are fantastic. Speaking of this clip I didn't mention it earlier. It's not deep carry. None of these really are. It's not a tremendous amount sticking out. And so this is one of the things, I don't love about the knife, but I accept any kind of clip like this is going to leave some amount sticking out. And that's pretty darn common on these higher end knives. From a functional perspective, very, very nice clip. Slides in and out, a lot of great retention. The one thing I do think about them though is that they feel a little bit bland to me, and I've always thought that. I really like this clip compared to the flat bent metal super not deep carry clip that he uses on the very base model that they used to use in the past. But I just think that given that the rest of the knife has these really nice swooping curves to it, that this relatively straight plain clip feels a little bit like an afterthought. And so it was really exciting to me to see that when he released his new Urban EDC knife, that's literally called Urban EDC, it's a partnership with Urban EDC Supply Co., that he created a more custom matching the style of the knife style clip for that. The last thing I want to mention on finishing is this. You can see TBC right there. That's Trevor Burger Customs. And he's engraved it on the inside of the knife. And there is nothing here. This knife is completely sterile. Completely. And I love that. That is a change that I'm really happy to have seen, because on older versions of this, he used to have the Burger Knives logo right here. And I think it's a great logo. I think it looks really cool, but it's pretty big. And for my personal taste, I would rather have no logo at all. And then secondly, I would rather have a maker's mark stamped in the inside. For a while, Trevor was putting TBC right here. And on some of his individually serialized ones, you'll see TBC 001 or something like that. And I personally don't like that. I don't like that location, and I don't really love the font he uses. It's kind of bulbousy looking and really kind of basic looking. It doesn't look particularly stylized, and given how sleek the rest of the knife is, I think that font is a little bit of an odd choice. And so while I think it's pretty insignificant if it's right there, I much prefer the TBC being on the inside and any kind of maker's mark being on the inside. So I was very pleased to see how sleek, refined, and clean he made these modern versions. So my final thoughts for this knife, these knives in general, is that honestly I'm blown away. These are very expensive knives, and so I should be blown away, but I've had a fair number of very expensive knives in my hands at this point. And these are truly exceptional. And the thing that really kind of surprised me is a lot of times really high-end knives kind of end up feeling not super duper functional. They end up feeling kind of more like art pieces. And that's perfectly fine. Having functional, even semi-functional art is a really cool way to experience art. But these knives, while they also have a lot of that kind of artistic splendor to them, these are exceptionally functional feeling. These are exceptionally solid feeling. There is such a utility feeling to this, despite how good and sleek it looks. And so I'm very excited to have this in my collection. I wish that it had a stonewash finish, like I said, because I think that this knife will actually make a really fantastic user. And I intend to use it that way. And so I am very pleased to have this. I don't anticipate this leaving my collection anytime soon with the caveat that unless I replace it with a different version that is even more. Like if I find that he does do a version that isn't acid but is stonewashed and is otherwise the same, or maybe if I get one of these that has like a really, really interesting inlay to me, it's possible I might quote unquote upgrade this by what I want out of a knife, but I'm pretty sure I want to have a Burger LEXK in my collection, period, because these are just so damn good. The thing I'm debating right now is whether or not I want to have an EXK. 2.75 inches is small, and I have, like I said, on the smaller side hands, and so they tend to work for me. But the thing is will it work meaningfully better for me? So I don't know. I might get one of those too, depending on what configurations I see, if one really calls to me. But at the end of the day, I freaking adore this knife, and I am really interested in checking out the other models that he has. He doesn't have a ton of other models, and the ones that you see the most often are the Atlas. But the Atlas comes in a flipper version, it comes in a top flipper version, and there's even thumb stud versions of those that I was able to find. Those I think are a little bit older, a little bit more rare. And so I am very pleased that after all of the time that I spent waiting for these knives to finally experience them, that they really do live up to what I thought they'd be. These are exceptional. Trevor Burger, you did an incredible job. I'm a fan for life. Okay, thank you for watching, and yeah, I'll check it out. I hope you like it, and yeah, I'll talk to you next time.